We're going to talk about Adelbert Ames today, and this is my title slide. So I was trying to put words on it, and either I could tattoo it on his forehead or I could blend it in his collar. So you don't get any words, but that's the title slide. And that is Adelbert Ames. To cut off this question, which I've had a couple of times already, it's Adelbert. And I don't know if you're like me, but I always said Adelbert. And if I don't watch myself, I'll say it again. Because Adelbert is, I don't know, it just looks like Adelbert and Southerners. But it's Adelbert. So we're going to be talking about Ames. And it's not really, I don't think I'm surprising anybody, it's not really a military study. I'll gloss over everything that's going out there. Feel like, you remember when those old truck stop motels where you could put a quarter in the bed? No?
No.
Only saw one in Shreveport, actually. That's a true story. Okay, so it's not a military study. It's more of his after, basically the years from 1865 to 1875 is what we'll be focusing on, 1876. And to show you what they did in the post-war years, and of course to link it to my home state of Mississippi, which obviously has a key connection with me. I'm interested in the subject, and I needed something on Reconstruction. Now, to begin with, Adelbert is born in Rockland, Maine in October of 1835. Now, you do the math on that, how old he's going to be. 1835, how old is he going to be when the Civil War breaks out? His youth was spent surrounded by stories of the Founding Fathers and debates on politics. And his father, if you could get a better father, or a better living for a father, was a merchant captain. And his father had circumvented the globe numerous times. Before his father's death, Adelbert accompanied his dad on several occasions, visiting various foreign ports and furthering his studies in the meantime. The one thing that I get about Adelbert Ames, as I go through his bio right here, is he's refined. He's classy. He's a gentleman in the first sense of the word, real educated. In 1855, Ames is going to enter West Point Military Academy. The superintendent at that time is an officer by the name of Robert E. Lee. Ames did well at West Point. He was well prepared for it. He went through 5 years of training at the point. One of my coworkers was asking me why he did 5 years at the point, and I don't really have an answer for that. They started 5-year classes would be my best guess on that. By the second year of his 5 years, he stood fourth in his class. By his 5th year, he stood 5th out of a class of 45 in general merit, overall category. Ames stood at roughly 6 feet in height. His hair is dark brown, his eyes a hazel brown, much like some people's spouses. Now, with war impending, Ames was assigned to the 5th U.S. Artillery, known as the West Point Light Artillery, and it was commanded by Ames' friend Charles Griffin. Now, action came soon enough, and at the First Battle of Bull Run, July of 1861, Ames found his battery getting all the adventure they wanted on top of Henry Hill, which is the main portion of the battlefield. In the midst of the fighting, Ames is going to receive a wound in the thigh, and he will refuse to relinquish the field. His soldiers will take him and prop him up on a limber or a caisson, and he will continue to direct the fire of the battery from that limber. Right there. Can you imagine? Ames stayed so long that the loss of blood eventually made him faint. I'm sure that was hard to tie off a thigh wound. He would posthumously, after the war, win the Medal of Honor for this action. So later on in the slide program, when you think you see an MOH on him, that is one. Now Ames returned from his wound in time to serve during the 7 Days Battle. That's around Richmond. And he was breveted to Lieutenant Colonel of Volunteers for gallantry at Malvern Hill. Ames wanted higher rank though, and after politicking in Maine for a slot, he received command of the 20th Maine in August of 1862. As commander of the 20th Maine, he was at Antietam, but luckily his regiment did not see much action during the battle. Although Chamberlain gets all the attention, it was actually Ames who led the 20th Maine during one of the charges at Fredericksburg. Was that Gods and Generals, where they cover Fredericksburg? After Fredericksburg, Ames went on a temporary detail to the staff of George Meade. It was in this capacity that Ames served at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and probably because of this connection with Meade, Ames received a promotion to Brigadier General of Volunteers. That's all who you know. He's 27 years old. He gets his first star. His new brigade, though, was not with Meade in the 5th Corps. It was in the 11th Corps under General O.O. Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, Francis Barlow's division. Of course, Ames' brigade. Now, everybody knows the story. For one reason or another, which is not really the focus of this talk, old Francis decided to take his division out in front of the rest of the Union line. And, well, you can judge by the map what happened next. Right there, those Georgians hop right on them and scatter Barlow's division. Ames is going to be part of that. In the midst of the retreat, Barlow was wounded and Ames assumed command of the division. They retreated back to Cemetery Hill after suffering much loss, and the next day suffered further on July 2nd when Ames' division holding Cemetery Hill were attacked by the Louisianians and the North Carolinians in nighttime fighting. The line broke again. You can only imagine what Ames was going through his mind at that time, now being the division commander. But his line broke again. The Union Army had to scratch and claw to retake the position. I now have in my notes reflection on Ames at Gettysburg. Yep. That's about what I think of that. Now, in August, Ames was transferred to the Atlantic seaboard, and there he commanded another brigade with Quincy Gilmore's forces in the attempt to take Charleston. From there, he went to Florida briefly before returning to Virginia. This will test your Civil War knowledge, as part of Ben Butler's Army of the James. Here's a picture most of you have never seen. And the newly formed 10th Corps. Ames is right there. Kind of neat. Ames served in William F. Smith's forces outside Richmond in what is commonly known as the Bermuda 100 campaign and part of the siege against Fort Harrison and Gilmore. I believe those forts are now part of Richmond battlefield. In January of '65, Ames was ordered to Wilmington, North Carolina, in the impending assault on Fort Fisher. Arguably, this is Ames' most important and leading role in the war. On January 15th, his division attacks the fort, and after heavy casualties and much hand-to-hand fighting, captures the place. As a result of his actions, he received a brevet promotion. This is at the end of the war. He received a brevet promotion to Major General of Volunteers and a full promotion to Brigadier General in the regular Army. Volunteer rank's not too good to have if there's not a war going on. They can get rid of you very easily. So to come out of the war with 1 star in the regular Army is not bad. Ames ended the war having risen from first lieutenant in the regular Army to a brigadier general in 4 years. He was 29 years old in 1865. His war record included 7 major campaigns, 16 battles in that, and skirmishes, and a record that's really not that bad. Obviously a brave man. In the post-war years, Ames initially went to South Carolina, but in 1866 took a leave of absence to travel abroad. He visited Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, and England. And if that wasn't enough, he went on to Italy and back to Scotland and Ireland. In other words, I envy him. He just took a leave of absence, so traveled around. I get the sense, well, I don't know how much. I get the sense, though, his family, he came from money. In 1867, Ames returned to the U.S. and resumed his Army career as a lieutenant colonel in the 24th U.S. Regiment. Just because you have a star doesn't mean they have a slot for you. All right, so he had to take a lieutenant colonelcy, and orders soon came for him to report to the 4th Military District of Mississippi and Arkansas under General E.O.C. Ord. Ames entered a completely different world at this point. This world was the era in American history called Reconstruction. Now let's back up a little before Ames gets there and look at the situation that he enters in Mississippi. I want you to think about these numbers right here, and if this happened in your area. Like every other southern state, Mississippi faced an economic, social, and political system in upheaval in the war's aftermath. Economically, the state was devastated. In 1860, the personal value of property, including slaves, was $352 million. In 1870, 10 years later, property was valued at $59 million. The value of real estate dropped from $157 million to $118 million. And cotton production went from 1.2 million bales in 1860 to 1870, when it was about half of that at 565,000. There's your economy. Now socially, several million slaves across the South were now freedmen. And the social order had been turned upside down. I think that's obvious. Now Republicans, the Republican Party, wanted these freedmen to vote Republican. And all the whites, the southern whites, wanted them to vote Democrat. Now you see what's coming. You've got two sides that are coming up. And it's going to boil down to race. A lot of this is going to boil down to a black and white question. But it all derives out of politics and the machinations that are going to be coming forth, as you'll see. Now, politically, the state government had been reconstituted under the proclamation of President Andrew Johnson. This is in 1865, 1866. Johnson appoints William Sharkey as provisional governor. The state constitutional convention repealed the ordinance of secession and ratified the 13th Amendment. However, the legislature also passed black codes, quote unquote, which basically replaced the word slave in the old laws with freedmen in the new one. Now these laws are never enacted and never put into effect. At least that's what I'm reading in Mississippi. They could have been in other places in the South. But that's not really the point. The point is it went over very badly in the North to have these black codes even being voted upon in the South, because the northern politicians, especially the radical Republicans, the ones that really want to tighten the screws down on the South, are not liking the way that these blacks are being treated, and they want to help them as best they can. Of course, they also want them to vote Republican. So that's the way you get it. You make them indebted to you. Now, these type of actions across the South led the U.S. Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. President Johnson, I love political cartoons, President Johnson vetoed the bill, and Congress, being majority Republican, overrode it. Congress even went a step further and refused to seat any of the newly elected legislative members from the southern states. So in other words, they had a vote across the South. They elected these people, a lot of them ex-Confederates, some of them ex-Confederates. They sent them back to Congress, and then they weren't recognized. They weren't given a seat, which is, you know, got under a lot of people's skins. Now this was the start, all this stuff was the start of a contentious relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, with Johnson favoring a more modern Reconstruction plan and Congress favoring a more radical one. Were Republicans in Congress able to override Johnson's vetoes, this historical period became known as Radical Reconstruction. From 1865 to 1870, there are 3 amendments passed. About everybody in here is familiar with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They have been called the Reconstruction Amendments. The amendments were directed at ending slavery and providing full citizenship to freedmen. Northern congressmen believed that providing black men with the right to vote would be the most rapid means of political education and training. Now, partly because, I'll give you a second to look at that right there. I don't know if we could get an amendment passed again today. I can't think of a subject you get one passed. It's how high the bar is now to get an amendment to modify the Constitution. Now, partly because the southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, Congress is going to pass the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into 5 military districts. States were required to ratify the 14th Amendment and draft a new Constitution. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Most of them had ratified the 13th Amendment, not all of them. They had to ratify it, and they had to draft a new Constitution which guaranteed the former slaves their rights. Now, how do you think this is going to go over? So, since they wouldn't do it, military rule was going to take over civilian governance, and this is how Ames is going to get involved here. Under the protection of federal soldiers, delegates convened in Jackson to write a new state constitution that would allow Mississippi to be readmitted to the Union. Now, I don't know, I'll take an aside, I'll come back to that in just a minute and go ahead. I probably should have done this earlier. This whole time period that we're going into, as I said, alluded to a little bit earlier, is a black and white period. I mean, it's divided by race. It's black and white. And of course, that makes me nervous, to be honest, to be talking about it, because there's nothing good that can ever come out of me talking about it, right? Because I can't please everybody. I have gone out of my way. I'm not going to talk about everything, because I can't talk about everything, but I've gone out of my way to make both sides look equally bad. And that's as fair as I can be. So I hope to hit down the middle right there. As neither side is looking too good at times. Right here. Now, Mississippi's draft in this Constitution, and 100 delegates were authorized for the convention. Now, Mississippi contains 61 counties at this time, with 32 of those counties being of a black majority in population. These 32 counties were given 70 of the 100 delegates, while the 29 majority white counties were given 30 delegates. However, it is the first time on the other end of it, spectrum, it is the first time that black people have participated as a political body in the state of Mississippi. So a historic moment, to say the least. But obviously, they've skewered it's not democratic, to say the least. Of 85 delegates that were eventually seated, 17 will be black, 19 would be conservative, that would be old line white Southerners, 29 would be native Republicans, meaning they would be Southern people that had joined the Republican Party, otherwise known as scalawags. Y'all don't remember Gone with the Wind? Scalawags. A scalawag, I'll use these terms because they use them back then, but I'll use these terms infrequently. A scalawag is a white Southerner who turns his back on the white people. That's what they refer to him as, a scalawag. All right, that's a thing right there, a term from that era. And there were some 20-odd carpetbaggers there too. What is a carpetbagger? A northerner who moves south. Okay, what is the only thing that a Texan fears? A Yankee with a U-Haul. There you go. I got this cold. It's very hard to do jokes with y'all today, all right? I'll do my best. So we got these carpetbaggers coming down. Now most of these carpetbaggers, ironically, were former Union Army officers looking for a new living. The Constitutional Convention became derogatorily known as the Black and Tan Convention. Despite much extravagant spending on the convention, what do I mean by that? They ran up the bill. They ran up the tab when they didn't need to. The Constitution that they did produce guaranteed universal male suffrage. On the other hand, and this is key to understanding what's going to come here, the Constitution disbarred almost everybody connected with the former Confederacy from holding office. Why do you think they did that? Who wasn't in the Confederate Army? See how the two sides are being juxtaposed against each other. You've got, I wouldn't say it's completely, you can't blame it on everybody, but you've got so many people pulling different factions in different directions, all for their own self-centered purpose. Whites, blacks, Republicans, Democrats, Northerners, Southerners, all of that's in this bowl being mixed up. And we'll see how it comes out. It was in this state of affairs that Adelbert Ames, that's pretty blue, isn't it? That Adelbert Ames is going to come to Mississippi. He will take over in 1868 as provisional governor of the state. But even his first step started with controversy. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, look, Ames aside, take a look at the picture. 1868, 3 years after the Civil War, and they put who in charge? Oh, that's really, it's like, y'all ever poured salt on a slug and bring it? Oh, nothing good can come out of that. Don't ever think it wasn't intentional. Upon his arrival, he was ordered to assume the governorship from the civilian governor, the duly elected governor, by the name of Benjamin G. Humphreys. Right there? Well, why do we know Benjamin G. Humphreys? He took over for Barksdale. Right? Here at the battlefield. I wish y'all could be right here standing on this podium with me right now. You see all the light bulbs going off. It's like little light bulbs, See? How's the audio? Audio coming through there, Caitlin? All right. He also, 21st Mississippi?
Yes.
Right? He chases 9th Massachusetts battery all the way back to the Trossel farm. Right there. Miss Eric Campbell. Every time I think about the 9th Massachusetts battery, I think of Eric Campbell. Anyway, B.G. Humphreys, old Confederate general, is now the governor. This presented a problem because Humphreys does not recognize Adelbert Ames as the governor. And Adelbert Ames has been sent by the government in Washington to assume the governorship. So this presented a problem for Humphreys, and he wired President Johnson for his opinion. Humphreys, after he received the response from the president, Humphreys then told Ames that he wasn't leaving. Quote, "I must therefore," Humphreys replied, "in view of my duty to the constitutional rights of the people of Mississippi and the disapproval of the President, refuse to vacate the office of governor or surrender the archives and public property until a legally qualified successor under the Constitution of Mississippi is appointed." Think he's a lawyer? After much correspondence, which drug on for several weeks, Ames finally positioned 2 guards outside the governor's office in the old Capitol. The old Capitol still stands, one of the few buildings that survived several visits by Sherman. There's a new Capitol and the old Capitol, but the governor's office is still there. I don't even think well, there's a lot that happens in the governor's office, but they don't even advertise that. But every time I go in the old Capitol in Mississippi, I think of this scene right here that occurred, because I don't know if it's ever happened like this before or since in American political history. Ames just decided to quit bickering with Humphreys, and he positioned 2 guards outside of the governor's office. Well, eventually, Humphreys had to come out of there. You know, he didn't like he had his own kitchen in there or something, in his bed or something, so in a bathroom, and so he had to come out. And when he exited exited the office and went to wherever he had to go, and he came back, the soldiers crossed the bayonets across the door and would not allow him back in the governor's office. And that's how you remove a governor, through military force. Some might argue it was a coup. Humphreys would argue it was a coup. Now, it's still not over, though, because Humphreys is still in the mansion. And he didn't appear to be wanting to leave there either. Ames had the awkward task of moving in with Humphreys. I think he told Humphreys he could take the upstairs. He'd take the downstairs. When Ames eventually asked Humphreys to vacate, Humphreys informed Ames that the mansion was built by the taxpayers of the state, and he was the duly elected constitutional governor. Therefore, he declined to vacate until a legally qualified successor could take his place. On July 10, 1868, Ames' patience ended. Addressing a letter to General/Governor Humphreys, he stated, quote, "You entirely ignore the Reconstruction Acts." I love when they get petty in these formal terms. "You entirely ignore the Reconstruction Acts and the action taken by those empowered to act upon them. I recognize no other authority. The feeling entertained not only by me but by others, not to cause you any personal inconvenience, has, through your own action, ceased to exist." Ames then had a guard remove Humphreys' belongings from the mansion, and the governor and his family were marched out of the mansion between a file of guards. And thus Ames officially became the provisional governor of the state of Mississippi at age 33. So you have this thing, if you're not picking up on it, you have a military officer. He's still got his commission. He's still active military. I'll show you his governor's portrait in just a second. You've got a military officer serving as governor, appointed by Washington over a civil government. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Now, Ames's main job, there's his governor's portrait. I think that's kept in a broom closet. I was joking. There's other governors they've stuck in the broom closet. Bilbo would be up there, I bet. His main duties, Ames' main duties, were to maintain peace and order, and second, to oversee the reestablishment of a new state government. In other words, Ames is supposed to keep the machine running and make sure that the government, they are able to form a government which will comply with the Reconstruction Acts. The voters, though, had other ideas and instantly threw him the first curveball when they rejected the new state constitution drafted by the quote-unquote Black and Tan Convention, which I talked about earlier. Voter fraud and intimidation was alleged, but it's hard to separate fact from fiction. This is what exactly happened. Ames thought, for his own self, Ames thought that Mississippians had rejected the Constitution because blacks were given the right to vote and most former Confederates were disenfranchised. That was his opinion. Nevertheless, Mississippi had not complied with the requirements for readmission, and Mississippi became, along with Texas and Virginia, the, quote, last unreconstructed states. upon Ulysses S. Grant's election, as President Ames was now appointed, in addition to being governor, as the new military commander of the 4th Military District. Now, Congress now stipulated that all office holders in Mississippi had to take the, quote, ironclad oath of allegiance or be removed from office. Okay? Ames was given free rein to appoint who he chose to every position, and quote unquote loyal men at that. Now I want you to think about these statistics I'm about to give you, and one person having this much power at 33. Ames removed and appointed 60 sheriffs, 72 circuit and probate clerks, 60 county assessors, 50 mayors, 220 aldermen, 385 justices of the peace, 165 constables, 370 members of the Board of Police, 40 coroners, 20 surveyors, 25 city marshals, and more than 300 election registrars. And even such minor officials as school commissioners, city collectors, superintendents of the poor, etc. Can you imagine having that much patronage power in a little state like that? The problem, though, with reconstituting the government is, where do you find competent people to step in there that are going to be ethical and competent? Where do you find those? Because all of the white Southerners are what? They're not going to take it. They won't take the oath. And all of the blacks, they've received no education. For generations, have received no education. So who does that leave you? That leaves you a lot of white Northerners who come in, and blacks. They put blacks in there also. Now, he had to rely on the recommendation of others for so many appointments, and in many instances, I think he was deceived. And this, ladies and gentlemen, though, for better or worse, is how the carpetbaggers gained power over the state and local government, which eventually led to graft and corruption, which in turn resulted in persecution, fraudulent elections, and finally, elections. Now, before I go to carpetbaggers, I might point out right here, a lot of you have heard me refer to it, right there, ladies and gentlemen, is Houston, Mississippi. Okay? Now, when my mother went into labor, they had to drive, to show you how I've always been connected to the National Park Service. My mother and father had to drive the Natchez Trace at 80 miles an hour, some say 100. That's because my mother, I was the first child, my mother sat up all night reading a book trying to figure out if she was in labor or not. So when the sun came up, her mother-in-law, my father's mother, told her, for goodness sake, go to the hospital. So to be connected with the Park Service, they got on the Natchez Trace Parkway and did 100 miles an hour all the way up to Tupelo, where I was born on April 27th, 1971. Thank you. Right there. This is also the place where we used to, Houston is still a small town. All the people used to go up to Tupelo for your Friday and Saturday nights. That's where you used to take your dates and so forth. And on the Natchez Trace, I actually had a date get so mad at me that she got out of the car on the Natchez Trace. And I said to her as I stood beside the door and she was walking down the parkway, I said, I don't think you have anywhere to go. She eventually got back in the car and we had a lovely evening. Right there. Yeah, right there. For Okolona and the rest of Chickasaw County, I refer you to the Nathan Bedford Forrest lecture. I think I had some more stories on there. Okay, so what's this right here? Carpet bag. What's this right here? Oh, yes, look at him. Now, does anybody know who that, and I don't know why this is, but does anybody know who that is?
It says on the back, Schurz, Carl Schurz.
And was he here?
Oh, yeah.
He was here at Gettysburg. He became, I'm looking through all these political cartoons, or I don't run really looking for political cartoons, but I put in like subject, in the Google, and I search for images, and Carl Schurz comes up as a symbol time and again of carpetbaggers. And I think he was in charge of the freedmen throughout the South, not Mississippi. And he became, I guess, that symbol right there. Yeah. I'm sure he didn't like the likeness. Now, Ames also had the issue back in Mississippi of the freed slaves to deal with. Now, Ames lowered the poll tax to include more people. He also declared freedmen competent to stand as jurors in the state, which was a huge deal. This was a big step, a big deal, and it was due to Ames' convictions that it was done. Thomas Nast, political cartoon there. Due to Ames overseeing a statewide election in 1869, the Mississippi legislature convened for the first time since the rule of radical Reconstruction began. We're in 1869, and nothing defined the social revolution that was happening more than the legislature's composition that year. Some of the former richest counties in Mississippi were now represented by former slaves, and the Speaker of the House was from New York. They quickly ratified the 14th and 15th Amendment. Events quickly followed. In 1870, as was the custom at the time, I didn't know this until researching this, the state legislature back then elected the senators. Did you know that? There's two means, though, in the Constitution, right? To elect it. 17th changes it. You want to change it back? All right. All right, well, let's have a convention. All in favor?
Party of one.
Yeah. Party of one. Okay, pay close attention to this if you can read the writing up there. I know it's not the clearest shot, but read real quickly of what that actual document is right there, because it's going to go in. This is the document certifying by Adelbert Ames down here, the governor of Mississippi, that Hiram Rollins has been elected to the Senate. He's certifying the election. Keep that in mind because I couldn't find the copy that I really needed, but the document that I'm going to refer to in just a second had to look exactly like this. Now, Hiram Rollins at that time is elected to the U.S. Senate along with Adelbert Ames by the legislature in 1870. Their term began, they were fulfilling unfinished terms from prior to the Civil War. Their terms began on February 24th, 1870. Now, Hiram Rollins is an interesting character. He first came to Mississippi as a chaplain of a black regiment, USCT. In 1866, he moved to Natchez and helped set up free schools across the state. He became the first black man to serve in the United States Senate also, taking the place of the unexpired term of Jefferson Davis. Now, legend has it, I've never been able to pin down, but reportedly Senator Davis told one of his colleagues when he left the Senate that if Mississippi ever returned a representative to the United States Senate, that it would be a black man. And so that was prophetic. Right there. Thomas Nast. That's a very good likeness of Hiram Rollins. Right there. And I think that is that Schurz? Looks like him. All right. Now, ironically, Ames experienced, not Rollins, Ames experienced more trouble getting seated in the Senate than Hiram Rollins. As provisional military governor of Mississippi, Ames certified his own election to the Senate. And guess what? In parliamentary things, the Senate, somebody quickly raised an objection that Ames could not certify his own election. And so here we go. You can imagine, I've never understood all the inner workings of the Senate. They can pull out some arcane rules. But it took several weeks for Ames to get seated in the Senate. Nevertheless, throughout his Senate tenure, Ames was still plagued, despite being seated, by charges that his name was not duly that he was never duly elected to the Senate. It was a mistake by Adelbert to nominate himself to be the senator. He just should have known better. I guess his ego got the better of him. With the influence he exercised over the legislature, the fact he owned no real property in the state, he paid no taxes and held no allegiance to the people of Mississippi, it made him a very poor choice to be senator. But eventually this was worked out and Ames was admitted to the Senate. He became known, despite not starting this way, he became known as a good speaker and a debater. To back up a little bit though, while he waited to be seated, he occupied himself by wisely courting the daughter of Benjamin Butler. Are y'all familiar with Benjamin Butler? I can't believe that. She's pretty. You know, the thing, they actually, I couldn't find a copy, but in one of the books that I was researching here, one of the newspaper correspondents, you know how they used to sketch things as they were happening? The newspaper correspondent was sitting in the galleries of the Andrew Johnson impeachment trial. And he was sitting across the aisle and he actually sketched Ames and Blanche Butler courting, talking to each other. You know, she was sitting in the pew in front or the aisle in front, the seat in front, and she was turned around and talking to him. Well, that was the first time they had met. And she made such a direct impact on Adelbert Ames, an impression is a better word, that he never forgot her. And he would come back to Washington as much as he could. So that might have something to do with him wanting to be in the Senate. Right there. Might not have been about power after all. Now, they were married in 1871, and they would eventually have 6 children together. With the expiration of Hiram Revels' term, James L. Alcorn is going to take his seat. Now, Alcorn is an interesting figure. He's going to take his seat beside Ames. He's a native Mississippian. He served briefly in the Confederate Army before returning home, and he lost 2 boys to the war, fighting for the Confederacy, including one that came home partially a deaf and a drunk. He probably needed counseling. All right. On his grave, James L. Alcorn, would write the following epitaph, that he died from the insane war of the rebellion. Probably his son died of PTSD. War drove him insane. He committed suicide in 1879. Alcorn said he just never was the same. The son was never the same after the war. Despite being a Mississippian, Senator Alcorn became a scallywag, quickly joining the Republican ranks, and after serving as governor from 1869 to 1871 was elected to the Senate. Alcorn, though, becomes the leader of the moderate faction of the Mississippi Republicans, while Ames becomes the head of the more radical faction. Despite being on the same team, the two are going to clash often in the Senate, so much so that both men decide to run for governor of Mississippi in 1872. Ames was supported by African Americans and the carpetbaggers, while Alcorn was supported by conservative whites and the scallywags. Ames won handedly by a vote of 69,870 to 50,490. With Ames' election, the Republican-led legislature in Mississippi promptly raised the millage rate. You think, how many of you are getting ready for your taxes right now? All right. The legislature, not Ames, the legislature promptly raised the millage rate to 14 mills. Now, My home county of Chickasaw, where Houston is, had a county millage rate of 20. This act basically meant confiscation, to say the least. I mean, you can't pay it. So if you've got somebody, if you want wealth redistribution, how do you do that? You can't legally go and take somebody's property. All right, as long as they pay the taxes, you can't pay that. You can't do that. So what do? You jack the taxes up so far that these planters who own 1,000, 2,000 acres, these big planters, they can't hold it anymore because they can't afford it. Huh? How many of you thought about that when you bought your house? Do I want all this land? Do I want to pay taxes on this land? Right here. Also interesting to note is you look at the years right here. You got South Carolina, you got Mississippi, you got the years running down through here. You can see how they go up directly until Ames is elected governor. And then you will see that they start to drop back down as soon as Ames can get them back down. But you can basically double all those mills rates when you put in the local taxes. Now, in addition to that, the poll tax was increased from $2 to $6. And white employers were made responsible for paying for their black laborers. Cotton was taxed at $10 a bale, and the money had to go to the Freedmen's Bank. The legislature even imposed a 1% tax on travel. How they ever collected that, I don't know. The property owners simply couldn't pay these taxes, and 6.4 million acres of land ended up being confiscated. 6.4 million acres. Now, what would you do? Take race out of it. Put race in it. What would you do if you were in that position? This is not an easy subject to deal with, to think about. But what would you do? You have no representation if you're a white Southerner. You know, if somebody was going to take your home. Then again, what would you do if you were a black Southerner? Don't you think you come out of the war as a freed slave? Don't you think you're owed something? You're the one that built it with your labor. Now, the citizens petitioned the legislature to reduce the millage rate, but it fell upon deaf ears. And this really set the course for the white taxpayer revolt that followed. To Ames' credit, he did have the millage rate lowered in the subsequent years. And with all the graft and corruption that was alleged in the state, Ames was never accused of any embezzlement. Ames was never happy in Mississippi, though. His family remained in the North and returned there periodically for weeks at a time. When he was gone, he was not served well by the lieutenant governor, a guy by the name of Alexander K. Davis. One time when Ames went north, Davis discharged all the employees at the Capitol and put his friends in. He dismissed the governor's private secretary and then proceeded to appoint several judges. In 1 month, Lieutenant Governor Davis issued 34 pardons, 6 remissions of forfeiture, 6 commutations of sentence, Davis was later accused of taking a bribe in at least one case, probably a lot of them. Ames was beyond reproach in these matters, but the action still smeared his administration. In other words, he's getting blamed. On the local government level, much graft and corruption was taking place also. All the things I've described came to a head in September of 1874 in a place called Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, this story boils down to 2 things at work here: race and taxes. Almost all the elected officials were black, and the taxation rate was 14 mills for the state, 14 for the county, and for the municipal authorities it was 21.5. The county and city debt that stood at $13,000 in 1869 now stood, according to one congressional hearing witness, at $1.4 million. In 5 years, it went from $13,000 to $1.4 million. In those times, the sheriff wielded extraordinary power. and he picked the composition of juries and collected the state and local taxes. In Vicksburg, there was a sheriff named Peter Crosby, and he was alleged to have embezzled thousands of tax dollars and did not have a bond to cover his duties as a tax collector anyway. Now, Peter Crosby is black, and the local whites organized a taxpayers league for the 1874 election and won the county seats. Now they turned their attention on the sheriff who was still in office. He hadn't run for re-election in that term. At a meeting reportedly 500 strong, they drafted a resolution calling on Crosby to resign. The message was sent to the courthouse, and the reply was soon received from Crosby saying he wasn't leaving. The Taxpayers League then marched on the courthouse and made him another offer. At this point, he resigned. As provisional military governor, Ames had become used to being able to call on U.S. troops for any disturbances. But in 1874, he didn't have any troops at his disposal. He had militia. And that militia was composed of both black companies and white companies. Upon hearing the news of Crosby's removal, Ames sent orders to the local black militia company to suppress the riots. You see what's coming? He did not tell the white companies of his plans, reasoning that they wouldn't obey his orders anyway. Probably right. Meanwhile, on that Sunday, December 6th, the news spread in the black churches, and they determined to march upon Vicksburg in support of the sheriff. Now, white Vicksburgians armed themselves. Black freedmen armed themselves, and now a posse comitatus was in effect. Near the present-day surrender monument along the old battlefield at Vicksburg, the two sides bumped into each other, and shooting began. And when it ended, 2 whites and 29 blacks were dead. Subsequently, federal troops were sent by the district military commander at that time, Phil Sheridan, to restore order and return Crosby to office. But ill will was still felt toward Ames, who was accused of setting the fuse that started the whole thing. You know, I've thought about it putting this program together. I don't know what he was supposed to do. I mean, where do you even start tackling that Vicksburg story? Do you support Crosby? Do you support the Taxpayers League? If you support Crosby, who do you turn to support Crosby? I mean, who did he have? What were his options? I don't know. It looks like he was in a no-win situation there, whatever he chose to do. In 1875, white Democrats began to implement, quote, the Mississippi Plan to take back the state government. Armed groups of vigilantes, known as the Red Shirts, the Democratic Shooting Club. I like that one. Democratic Shooting Club. The White Club, etc., used economic and political pressure to keep white and black Republicans away from the polls. There were race riots in Yazoo City and Rolling Fork, with the largest occurring in Clinton. Ames appealed to President Grant for troops, but Grant, fearing the result of the upcoming election and their potential impact, didn't send any troops to help the governor. Ames called out the militia, or the only militia that he thought would honor his orders, and once again these black militia companies marching around the countryside in Mississippi just sent the anger soaring among the white population. And only a quick agreement for fair elections between the Democrats and Ames prevented a bloody outcome and a possible coup. Well, fair elections didn't happen. I think that's going to be pretty obvious. So a Republican majority of 30,000 votes in 1874 elections flipped to a 30,000 vote majority for the Democrats within 2 years. Flush with a Democratic majority in the 1876 legislature, the body promptly drew up impeachment charges against Ames. They charged him with responsibility for the Vicksburg riots and illegal pardon, judicial appointments when the Senate was out of session, etc. A trial commenced, but before it got well underway, an agreement was reached whereby the legislature would withdraw the charges and then Ames would resign. he agreed. In other words, Ames would not resign that governorship while impeachment charges were being held against him. Legislature had to drop him, and then he would leave. What choice did he have? I mean, they were going to, the charges were pretty flimsy, to say the least, but the votes were there. He was going to get impeached. Now, Ames is going to live until 1933. The last full-ranking general from the American Civil War. Y'all act like that's the best part of the whole program. I'll end with Ames' own words. It's kind of neat when you live so long you can help defend your legacy. In 1900, Professor James Garner wrote Ames regarding his time in Mississippi, and Ames responded in the following. Ames responded, "You ask, quote, what I consider some of the merits of your administration in Mississippi." Garner's asking Ames to tell him what he did good while he was there. "My dear professor, when you appear before St. Peter at the gates of heaven, what can you say in reply to his query as, quote, as to the merits of your earthly career? Question mark. To say I acted conscientiously to the best of my ability does not seem to be sufficient. To say that I did not saddle the state with a debt of millions on account of railroads and other like enterprises as I might have done, and as was done in other states, would be a claim of merit no honest man could make. Yet you know I am credited with that merit by my political opponents. As men's lives are generally consistent, and as I was honest and conscientious in financial affairs, how could I be otherwise in other affairs? No doubt it is true I did not appoint to office the best men in the state. But it is no less true that the best men in the state would not take the office at my hand. I hold I appointed the best men available. Could I do more? In closing, I ask you to look over the course of events during Ames' tenure in Mississippi. What would you do in his shoes? What would you do if you were a black citizen? What would you do if you were a white citizen? Do you find the people of Mississippi to be right, wrong, neutral? It's hard questions to answer, and I don't have an answer because I'm only the storyteller. But when you go out of here, hopefully we will never have another situation in this country where we have to go through an ordeal, a trial, tribulations, if you will, where this country has to come out on the other side and spill so much blood in order to do so. It's a heavy cost. And it didn't stop with the Civil War, to say the least. Thank y'all very much.